Hello, Podcast Village. Welcome to another episode of Colorblind, Race Across Generations. I am your host, Vanessa Eccles, along with technical producer Keith. Hello, Keith.
Hello, Keith.
Well, today we are talking about colorism. So if you don't know what that is, you are about to find out. We're talking about discrimination or prejudices within the race. And we have three very interesting guests today. Celie Riccio, who's a writer and social media influencer. She describes herself as Afro-Dominican. Kika Aruhu, who describes herself as Black American and Cuban. She's a diversity journalist and social media journalist as well. And Elaf Tamley, who is a grassroots activist, and she is North African. So let's just jump right into this discussion about colorism on Colorblind. So, welcome to our guests. We have Celie, who has
Hi.
been with us before. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming back. And we have Kika.
Hi.
We're glad to have you.
Thank you for having me.
And Elaf.
Hi.
So, ladies, I want to read something to you and get your reaction to it. In 2006, there was a study from the University of Georgia, and here's what it said. Employers of any race prefer light-skinned black men to dark-skinned men, regardless of their qualifications. There was a sociologist, Margaret Hunter, in a book called Race, Gender, and the Politics of Skin Tone. Here is what she said. Mexican Americans with light skin earn more money, complete more years of education, live in more integrated neighborhoods, and have better mental health than dark skin. In 2013, three researchers said they found that black female students with dark skin were 3 times more likely to be suspended from school than light-skinned counterparts. So we're talking today about colorism. Celie, what is it? How would you define colorism?
I think it permeates our society so much that I almost don't have the words to describe it. But colorism is basically choosing a lighter complexion or lighter features over dark. And it happens across the world. And it's something that, I think sometimes we think about it just happening here in the U.S., but it's something that actually is something that happens across the world.
And you're speaking from the perspective of someone who is, as we described it, Afro-Dominican.
Yes.
And so, Kika, how would you describe it? As someone who is Black American / Afro-Cuban?
So, living in two worlds, specifically, it is colorism in the States is one way, and colorism in the Caribbean is another way. So, where I fall in a certain category in the States, I don't fall in that category in the Caribbean. I'm at the bottom of the rung in the Caribbean, but it's important to understand that certain nuances in colorism, even though we all may experience it, we have to understand the nuances of why they exist in different places.
And so when you said you would fall in the bottom rung in the Caribbean, what do you mean?
So in the Caribbean, I'm dark-skinned, even though clearly I'm not dark-skinned. In the Caribbean, I'm dark-skinned, and my hair is nappy. I would not be the go-to girl if I lived in Cuba or the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico. It would be someone who was a Jennifer Lopez type or a Shakira type. Those are the women that are sought after typically in the Caribbean. In Spanish-speaking Caribbean, I can't speak for everywhere else, but Spanish-speaking Caribbean islands, those are the women that are sought after. So I would be the one told to mejorar la raza, marry somebody white or lighter so my daughter doesn't look like me.
That you would actually be told that. I mean, people will hear that and say, wait a minute, you would
It's
actually
a phrase
be told
that they
that.
say.
It's a phrase that's used regularly
Like,
to better the blood.
Yeah, we hear that, we know what it means.
So say it again. I've never heard it.
Mejorar la raza, or mejorando la raza, bettering the race.
Okay, because I have that
whiteness.
term, better, because we had another guest who was Hispanic who talked about how at her wedding she was told, oh, you're bettering the race because she was marrying somebody who is white.
Yes,
Yes, that's exactly what
it's
that
very
is.
common.
In fact, that is someone who's with us today. It's producer Keith's wife. That's why.
Oh.
Yeah, so that was, she said, and I was like, wow.
Yeah.
And so, Elif, how would you describe colorism from your perspective of being North African?
Sure. Colorism is a direct inheritance of colonialism. Its roots intersect with exploitation and Eurocentrism, and it's a tool of the system to privilege light skin tones over darker skin tones.
And so when people see you they, in the United States, they would be surprised to see or to hear or to know that you are North African. Do you find that?
I do. So I am overtly Muslim. I wear a headscarf or a hijab, and the initial assumption is Muslim. I guess the curiosity then follows, well, what kind of Arab, not even. And I'm not Arab. I'm North African Berber, the indigenous people of North Africa. So yeah, there is, I think for me, the faith precedes and kind of makes the initial assumption or impression prior to the skin tone.
And so when we talk about colorism, people who aren't people of color may say like, oh, well, that doesn't really exist. Is it a real thing, or is it just something that we as people of color have in our mind? Is it for real?
It's for real. And I love that Elif mentioned, colonialism, because it's another part of white supremacy, right? Another part of, you see this everywhere where we have, had colonization, and it's real. And there are phrases and there are things specific to describe certain skin tones and certain hair textures across the world. It's real.
And so what are they?
It depends. So we're familiar with the high yellow color, which is what I am called here in the States. In Dominican Republic, it's actually a very specific term given when you are light-skinned with black features and down to like a lighter colored hair. It's called being a Hava, and that's how I would be described. Whereas my sister would be described as a morena because she's about Kika's complexion. Down to, and it's something that you get called in the street. It's not even like, you get called, when you're being catcalled, they will use that descriptor.
Okay, so now is that something that's derogatory, or are they just using that because that's how you are described?
It just is.
In a cat call.
I mean, that's a whole nother podcast.
That's another podcast.
It's another podcast. But it hasn't been. I think part of the issue has been how certain spaces, have failed to recognize their own blackness. So that's, again, another podcast. But it just is something that I think people have gotten used to. When they get into a different space where they understand and, have a better sense of what that blackness means and how those terms aren't the go-to terms or preferred, then it changes. And usually it doesn't happen until, unfortunately, people come to the States. Although I have seen a movement, specifically in the Dominican Republic, to kind of better understand and accept the blackness that's there. And, of course, the different hues, right? So we have these conversations. Last time we talked about, having the conversations with our kids around this is the spectrum of color, right? It's not just one or two, and we don't fit in a Crayola box. So, but it's real, unfortunately.
And so, Kika, you have written about this a lot. Why are you so passionate about this issue?
Well, it's just I have a daughter, so, and it's something I've probably lived all of my life. But specifically when we moved from north to south, my daughter was directly affected by colorism. So my sister's
How so?
Oh, so I'll preface it with my sister's dark skin, and my sister has very fine features. Like I have very African features. My sister has very fine features. So the things that normally come with being darker skinned, my sister has not gone through. My daughter, on the other hand, we lived in Connecticut initially. It was We Are the World, Children of the Rainbow, everybody sat with each other. Specifically when we moved to Orlando, her first week of middle school at her new school, my daughter is a very obvious looking light-skinned black girl. She doesn't have good hair, in quotations. She has an afro, but she's an obvious black girl. But both of her parents are Latino. Both of her parents are black. she had to choose a side coming here. So they told her she could either be with the Latinos or she could either be with the black girls. Wow. She's both.
She had to pick a side.
Well, yeah, she was like, I'm not picking a side because I'm both. So there's that. But the other thing that happened was it was the end of the year school picture where all the friends were taking pictures. And one girl specifically said, my daughter's name, you can't be in this picture. It's a darky picture. And my daughter was like, what? So that's foreign to her. And when she came home, I just had to really break it down to her from a historical standpoint, from a U.S. historical standpoint, and also from a Caribbean historical standpoint. And she was just like, that is crazy. But now that she's older, she's 16 now, it is like everywhere, social media, entertainment, like she is noticing that there is a huge difference between how light-skinned women are perceived and dark-skinned women are perceived. And because she's light-skinned, she has to acknowledge that she's on the winning end of that. In quotations, winning is in quotations. But so we have discussions about it now. But when she was younger, she just was like, I don't understand that because we're all black. But
And so I think what's interesting for people to understand is we have this perception that maybe this is just an issue for black people in America, but it is for people around the world. I found one stat in my extensive research about what's happening in India. And in 2014, they spent $500 million in the skin lightening industry.
Yep.
So that because people wanted to look lighter, with this whole idea of, having a caste system, and, if you're dark skinned, then you're in the lower class. If you're light skinned, then you're in the, higher class, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it. So it seems to be a universal thing of this idea of the lighter, the better. Elaf?
Absolutely. I think anywhere with a colonial past faces issues of colorism. And I can speak, for instance, from Middle Easterners comparing to Africans, North Africans. They tend to be a lot lighter. For instance, Lebanese, Syrians kind of have Caucasian features, lighter eyes, lighter hair, lighter skin tone. And there's this condescending attitude that they're, in a sense, superior because of their looks or because of the privileges afforded. They won the, genetic lotto. So it's not unique to the United States. It's across the globe. And I guess the common denominator is praising whiteness or looking up to the white man. A lot of it derives from patriarchy. And so I think women of color have been fighting and are finally finding the courage to step up and to cater, for instance, within the fashion industry, to where women of various shades are finally finding foundation tones that work for them. We're not solely confined to, as you stated, we're not in a Crayola box and confined to the mainstream narrative.
I wanted to add on to what you said, Elaf. So I grew up in a Muslim household, ironically. My father's family is Muslim. And they were Muslim. They were brought here as Muslims during the slave trade. So it was just, they were Muslims. And so when we talk about white supremacy, we're not only talking about European white supremacy. We're talking about white Arab white supremacy as well. So countries like Saudi Arabia and I can't even think of another country, but like countries like Saudi Arabia or Arabic nations outside of, Tunisia, Tanzania, where Islam was forced upon people. These were people who actually went into Africa in the same way the Spaniards went to the Caribbean or the English went to the States and forced their faith on people. African people like me, African people like Elof, they changed the dynamic of a continent via religion. So it's important that when we talk about white supremacy, that we're not just talking from a Eurocentric standpoint, that we're talking about wherever whiteness is in your part of the world. So I just wanted to add on to that, because it's ironic that I grew up in a Muslim household. My family's from Ghana and Ivory Coast.
So how do you explain to people how this is bad or damaging if we're talking about colorism, because we're talking about discrimination within your own race, whatever your race is? Why is that bad, other than the obvious reasons?
Well, I mean, nobody should have to take a pay cut or not have access to something solely based on color. Like if it's my skill set, or if it's how I learn something, then yeah, I'll take the loss. But if I'm better at what I do, and you only have a preference based on how someone looks, there's no fairness in that. That's not a reason to be based. And that's not a reason to be judged.
Right. And it's, it happens across the board. So my best friend, actually, her dissertation was around hair and in the diaspora. And she did these surveys where she showed women with different hairstyles. And of course, sometimes those hairstyles, were directly related to skin color. But even that, people, down to how much money they made, they were able to say who was most successful, who had a 4-year degree, who had a master's degree, what religion each person was based on hair. And the joke was that it was the same woman with different hair on. But if it's that obvious, then it's happening when you're looking at, people's complexions. And it happens at work. If I have something formal, I will probably straighten my hair. If I'm going to a certain space and I want to, show us, or if I want a certain reaction, then there are things, and I think it's, it's really interesting because people talk about, hair is a whole other discussion.
And we had a podcast on hair, so.
Yeah. And so it's, just that discussion around what that looks like and what that brings forth. And it's the same thing with skin color. And you can see that. You can see someone coming into a space, and if you pay attention, depending on where you are in the country, in some places it's a little bit more overt, you'll be able to see how people react, how, other people of color react and how white people react. And it happens. And I think my biggest concern is obviously how it affects the kids. A few years back, I had to write an article because a little Puerto Rican boy called my child black and ugly at school. And so we've had to have this discussion from early on, because she, I sit here and try to instill this, pride in her and what she looks like in her hair and her skin tone. But inevitably, this happens. And she was, I think, 4 when it happened. And so it's everywhere. And so it has to be discussed, and we have to keep talking about it, because I think sometimes it's so ingrained in us that we don't realize that we're doing it,
So this was another child of color.
Yes.
Talking to a child of color.
Mm-hmm.
And so when this happened, how do we deal with this, first of all, in the family? Because if we're going to deal with it on the outside, we have to start in our own family. So you've given one example. So how do you deal with this whole issue in the family? Because you could have a family with like a whole lot of shades going on.
Yes, I will tell you that I laugh because I have very clear memories of my father kicking out people in the family that made racist comments, like kicking them out of his house, because he was I grew up with a father that moved here in the late 60s, who's, darker skinned than I am. And I grew up with a very, the statement that continued to ring, in the home was that you're black and don't you forget it. And so for him, it was the idea of, you're not going to make any statements in this house. You're not going to make any racist statements. You're not going to, down anyone because of the color of their skin. So though it was kind of militant, and I can look back and think it was funny and cheer him on, because I totally would do that. It's also the education piece. So I've had to have discussions with my family about how I felt as a child, because they treated darker skinned people in a certain way. Because I grew up, in a house where I immediately knew that I was black. But because I was lighter skinned, I was treated differently by other people not in the house.
Differently better?
Yes. And then, well, not even better, but they wanted me to not like the darker skinned people that that took care of me, that I associated with. And so I grew up feeling that colorism very early on. And I developed, and for me, because these were the people that I loved and the people that loved me, I identified more with them. So it felt very personal that it was being done. And it wasn't like, oh, they're being treated like that. It was, we're being treated like that. And so now it's just having the conversation where, as adults, we have talked about it, with my cousins that maybe did that, and they understand that it's not right now, but it happens. It's the little comments. I get nervous at family functions because I know that I hope not, but there have been times when things have been said, and I'm the wet blanket. I'm the one that has to make a statement and say that's not allowed. Why would you say that? Why would you think that? And make people think. And it makes it not fun, but it's something that I've just realized that has to be done. And, for whatever reason, I kind of do the short stick on that because I also have to set the example and, let my child know that that's not allowed. We're not going to talk about that. And if someone says it, it's going to be called, So that's been one of the things that we've struggled with, but I think have gotten better with making sure that families talk about it.
So even as a child, you probably didn't know the term colorism, but you felt there was something going on.
Yeah, I felt it, and I remember comments being made about those black people or the black people, or, I have very clear recollections of that.
Black people making comments about black people.
I mean, yeah.
What it boils down to.
Right. And again, a whole other discussion around, what blackness is within the Latino population. But having that of, maybe my father wasn't black, but, so I'm a little lighter. And so people had that idea. And it was, it colored everything they did, for lack of a better term. And they thought they were better, and that's just how it came across.
And so, Elif, tell us about what you experienced in this area.
I was raised overseas. I was born in the States, raised in Morocco. And as far as colorism, a lot of my experiences derive from post-colonial ramifications. And so a lot of the remnants are aspiring to the French. The French had a long presence in Morocco. And so part of their transformation of the country was to eradicate the language. A lot of the indigenous languages were eradicated. French was a language of the prominence, of the upper class, and lighter features, even African features were looked down upon, and any, I don't know, whatever lighter features are to anybody, were something of the more attractive, more successful. And so these are things that are widespread and that we witness today, unfortunately. You mentioned statements referred to or thrown around. I remember being in Spain on a tour, and the tour guide made a comment about the infrahumanos, referring to the Africans in Spain, or those that migrate for better opportunities. Infrahumanos being lesser human. My jaw dropped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And so the truth is that this is the way we're perceived. And it stands true today. It's so embedded, it's so ingrained, it impacts every sphere of life. And the sad part is those that feel it the most are those of lower socioeconomic status. And it impacts the criminal justice system that's biased and flawed, and It's unfortunate. I guess change begins at home with parents in the household, at schools. It's going to take time, but we will witness change.
So, Kika, is it odd or scary or discouraging that we're still having this kind of conversation in 2018 to talk about discrimination within the races, light skin, dark skin, everything in between?
Not odd at all. I mean, even though slavery or colonization ended in most nations, ended in quotations, Haiti still pays a colonial tax to France in the 20th century. So, I mean, it's not surprising. However, there seems to be a surge in becoming more educated and openly discussing it, whereas before it wasn't really openly discussed.
What Celie was saying, that we don't want to talk about it.
Like, just even in Southern families, people in the States, like, you just know that, your light-skinned cousin is a cute one, and you don't ever say anything back to your grandmother for saying that. But now I think, and I'm not a millennial, but credit to the millennials. I think they're more open about having the discussion because they have to always say how they feel about everything. And that's not a bad thing, millennials. But they're having the conversations because, like, they're like, hey, this is damaging us. This happened to my mom. This happened to my grandmother. We don't want to be like that. So the conversations are happening. The changes are happening fast enough, but at least the conversations are being had, which is a good thing.
And so the conversation is having sometimes to make people uncomfortable. It's what Celie said. She is, Debbie Downer at the family reunion because people say things and then you want to give a diversity lesson or,
I walk with PowerPoint presentations for it.
She has a spreadsheet.
So is that the issue? That's why we don't talk about it, is because it's a difficult conversation. It's what, Kika, you said about the, grandma says something. You don't want to say, listen, grandma, you're wrong, even though she's wrong.
Well, and it also has to do with you taking ownership of your own identity too. Like I call myself negra. You know that I'm black as soon as I say negra. That is a conscious decision on my part to say that. So you won't. It's not mixed. It's not half and half. It's negra. It's black right in your face. This is how I identify. This is who I am. It's important to say that out loud. If you want to have a conversation about colorism and changing things, it's important to put who you are out in the open. A lot of times there's this whole, somebody's Indian in your family or somebody was Italian, your great-great-grandmother married a Chinese man or whatever that was. But, we try to wash out.
No, that is because I always say, like, every black person in the South, those are the the that you always hear, like, we're part Indian. I have Ancestry DNA, and I'm like, y'all.
No.
Somebody lied to you.
Zero. There's nothing on there that said Native
It is so
American.
not
I
likely
said,
to
quit
happen.
saying that because, in fact, it showed I'm 2% Russian. I said, we're Russian. We are not Indian, so quit saying that. But,
You are more likely to be Russian than Indian,
yes.
yes.
We're
The
part
Native
Indian.
American,
No,
yes.
we're not. Okay, but go ahead.
Yeah, so it's important that we have pride in who we are too. So you can't water that down with some, being Native American, Cherokee in your family.
Mm-hmm.
I love that point, Kika. I love that you stand up and you say, I'm a negra, because there's nothing wrong with color. There's nothing wrong with pigmentation. If that's who you are, amen. More power to you. The connotations, the loaded connotations that have been injected into that is the problem.
Yep.
Right.
The way society has played around and manipulated and injected, it's so hard to not internalize. So how do you explain to, how old is your daughter?
8.
How do you explain that to an 8-year-old? To say that, that's your color and this is what you're going to face in society. That is the problem. But to stand up and say, yes, I'm a negra, so be it.
So how do you say that to her? How do you instill in the children that, you are black and you are dark and you are beautiful and all of that?
It's something, as with everything else, I'm learning as a parent that it's consistent discussions. It's not one time that we're going to have the talk. So obviously that one time when this child said this to her, we had the discussion, and it was actually really interesting because she didn't say this to me. Her best friend mentioned it to her mom, and her mom was the one that called me, and it was like weeks later. And so she thought it was ridiculous because, first of all, again, define black to a child, they automatically, again, think back to, the coloring box. And she was like, well, no, I just didn't, she didn't even think about it because she was like, well, actually, I'm brown. So it was very specific and concrete at that age. But we talked about skin color. We looked in our own family, in her family, on both sides, and what that looks like. And how blackness isn't necessarily a skin tone. So that's been the discussion. We've gone through and done Google searches, and I've shown her albinos that are black, and then these beautiful like mahogany colored people, and it's like they're black too, and one isn't better than the other, and it's constant. And it's also, I think, again, back to when we're having discussion with family and having to speak out, is using those as examples. And especially if she's in the room, I am more likely to say something if she's in the room than not, because she needs to understand what's correct and what's not correct, in the same way that I understood that very early on from the things that my dad said. So it's consistent conversation and showing her and exposing her to blackness and what blackness looks like. We went to Dominican Republic for the first time this summer. So she got to see blackness a little bit different, and her cousins, So I want her to experience all that blackness has to offer. And again, it's not a monolith. So I always take it as a learning and a teaching experience, with our friends, with family. Obviously we're going to have some uncomfortable discussions, but it's also important for her to see that. And it's important for her to be able to verbalize that moving forward, because there are kids that she knows that aren't having the conversations, that are already feeling the effects of colorism, that, are being told that they can't be played with because they're darker, or, and I've heard that, unfortunately. And sometimes parents aren't equipped to have that conversation. So it's
so
just continual.
You've heard that here in 2018.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. And it, like Ika said, it's not surprising. It's disappointing when you hear it, but it's not surprising. I think my big concern is making sure that the kids are okay. We know where it comes from. It's infuriating to hear other kids, make these comments, because then you know that you can control what you teach at home, and you can control maybe can make a recommendation to me. Your friends can do that, but how do you address another parent who is teaching their child this? And then it comes the more uncomfortable conversations, because I didn't get a chance to speak to that mother of that child. I don't know how eloquent I would have been, but
or how physical you would have been.
I wouldn't have been physical, Vanessa. I'm not that kind of person. I'm a lover, not a fighter. But it's one of those things where we have to keep having the conversation. And sometimes I do feel hopeless sometimes, being in the social justice space. It's difficult because I see so much of it. You mentioned the school to prison pipeline, and it's so obvious in that space when you see the kids that are, being expelled and that, are being given detention. It's so obvious, especially with our black girls.
It's not a coincidence.
It's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. And how, we're thought to be more aggressive, and how, all of these things come together, and it does, come down to a certain extent to colorism. But it's hopeless sometimes, but I think having conversations like this gives me a little bit of hope, and continuing the conversation in online spaces helps. But ultimately, it's going to take a village to change this.
And so how do you think, images that we see play into this? Images that we see on television or magazines, what is beautiful black? Is it the light skin, almost white look, or is it the dark skinned, like really dark skin look?
I mean, I think you see what, what gets the ad spaces, right? What's beautiful to me is, again, I love the range of color. Being Hyella, this is who I am. I think I'm cute, but it doesn't have anything to do with my complexion. But
And you might want to explain to some people who are listening what high yellow is.
high yellow is when you're really light skinned. I don't know how else to explain it.
That's it. But
But not white looking.
But not, yeah, with black features. And so, the standard of beauty changes. Like every time we turn around, it's something different. And so, I love the campaign, like Dove's campaign of, my black is beautiful, because, that goes back into body positivity. I try to remember, and even in the spaces. So for me, I make it a point that if I'm, for example, on a panel, and I'm the light skinned girl, and there's a darker skinned person, I do try to center that person. Again, we talk about concentric circles, in social justice. It's being mindful of that as well, understanding that people might have a perception of me. Going into a room and knowing that people might have a perception of me, and using that perception to actually pull in my darker skinned sisters into the middle. So it's the same thing, I think, with the standard of beauty. I always, when I see a beautiful person, it's a beautiful person, inside and out, different complexions, that doesn't matter to me. So I think that standard, obviously what we see on TV, we usually like to see, we can get into who's a better rapper and who's a light skin and who's a dark skin. That is just part of the colorism, and changing that is going to take work.
So, Kika, what do you see in that when you look at how images play into this whole idea of colorism, and how people of the same race will have different beauty standards based on, how black are you or not black are you?
Because I'm an old lady, I always use the standards of 90s videos, like R&B and rap videos. Like, if you look back in those videos, Teddy Riley, Big Daddy Kane, those kind of videos, they were only black girls. And I'm not saying, when I say black, they might be in the diaspora, but they weren't ambiguously black. It wasn't the multi-ethnicity black that they have in calling cards when they're looking to cast. They were like, oh, that's a black girl. So that standard, I remember when it shifted, I was like, where are the black girls? You always have a black guy in the video, but I was like, where are the black girls? Because then it was like, okay, California, she might be Swedish. Her mom is Swedish, her dad is black. Or just, however ambiguous a black girl could be, that shift happened. And then it shifted to Latinas, but not black Latinas. And everybody thought Latinas looked like Jennifer Lopez. That was every Latina was that girl in the video. So I remember the shift, and I was just thinking, like, damn, I can't get represented anywhere, huh? That's crazy. Okay. So for me, everything that I do, like when I center people, and yes, there are beautiful people in every race. Let's get that out the way. But when I center people, I center black people. That's what's important to me. Not taking anything from anyone else, I center black people. So whether they're from the Sudan, or whether they're from Jamaica, from DR, Cuba, Brazil, the States, wherever, I center black people. I don't care where you're from. If you're black, that's who I center in terms of beauty. I don't even look at other standards. Like, they don't exist to me at all.
Do you think there's still this idea of people within the races being jealous of other people who are light skinned or resentful of them because of light skin?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you are... So, outside of the States, there are color caste systems. Like, Brazil has over 20 names for being black. Over 20. In Cuba, there are at least 10. When you start going outside of these places, there is envy. Like, Cafe Olé, girl gets treated better than a bronceada, a bronzed girl. So if you're constantly fighting to be on the higher rung of a ladder, yeah, there's going to be resentment. You're going to do things that are detrimental to yourself, detrimental to your family, detrimental to your children, just to claim a space that really doesn't exist. Because at the end of the day, you're all still black and you're all still being treated like crap. So you're fighting for peanuts. You're literally fighting for peanuts. So, I mean, resentment exists, but we have to find a way to be like, hey, this is not how we make the change by fighting each other. We have to turn all that energy to the source.
And so, based on all of that we have discussed, when you look at this issue, is it worse to be discriminated against by someone of another race or someone within your race?
Within. No question for me.
Well,
don't everybody talk at once.
Within,
I mean, really, when you think about
because
it.
there's a sense of betrayal.
Absolutely.
You share the same blood kinship, and so one is privileged and stabbing their brother for peanuts. I guess, I don't know, is that an ethics question? Is that...
I mean, I think when you're a person of color, though, I can't speak for anybody else. I expect it from outside sources. I don't go into it thinking I'm going to be given a fair shake. That's just, historically, that's just what it's been. So if I already go into a situation already knowing what exists, I can know how to play that game. When it's my sister or somebody I consider to be my sister or my brother, and we're trying to get to the same place, and I'm trying to help you, and then I see this, it's like, well, damn.
It's hurtful.
Yeah.
And it is
it's definitely
worse.
more.
There's a certain level of
hurtful from us.
vulnerability there that maybe we wouldn't allow ourselves in a different space. So
Absolutely.
in this space, I consider this a safe space with the three of you. So knowing that and going into it with that, I might make myself more vulnerable in those spaces and say things that maybe I wouldn't say. And then having those same constructs of, white supremacy coming in and, basically backstabbing you. I think it's a lot more hurtful because of the kinship that's expected,
So how do you think history plays into all of this? Because it's probably the basis of what we're talking about. I mean, have you ever heard of the brown paper bag test?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is, so explain to people what that is, because it's pretty much what it says. You match the skin color against the brown paper bag, and if you're light enough, then you can be a part of the elite society, which was back in the, 1940s, 50s. We don't have, and it physically was putting the brown paper bag up to your face. So it was a physical test. We don't have that physically, but we still kind of have it, that mentality.
And we have it, and then if you think about it, I hear some of my friends say that, when they were little, they couldn't play outside in the summer because
you get too black.
Their mom, because they would be too dark, or so it's something that continues. And then speaking about the historical aspect, I always think about again, when we're looking at constructs, we didn't bring this on ourselves. We didn't wake up one day and say, hey, it would be really cool if we separated ourselves, right? And if you think about how that was done, and I know in the States there's always a discussion around who was in the field and who was in the house.
Because if the house would be the lighter skin and the field would be the darker ones.
And so we forget about that. We forget that we had these constructs, put upon us, whether we liked it or not, by force, by violence. And now it's been ingrained, and it's a task of unlearning that. And it's almost something that we carry in our DNA, right? The ones that survived that, the ones that were able to acquiesce and were able to live with that, are the ones that are here still. So it goes back to all the historical, aspects that we think about, because it's still there. And the paperback test, we've heard that. We used to hear that from our sorority, and it's something that is real.
Because that was the test. It's like if you wanted to get into certain clubs, if you wanted to get into certain organizations, you had to pass that test.
And let's not forget the people that actually could pass and did back in the day when, Jim Crow and everything else. So, and they were encouraged by their mom, who might have been darker skinned, to pass, because they knew that they would get a better life, in quotations, because then you have to live with the secret for the rest of your life.
And so, again, some people might not understand what passing is.
Passing is when you are light-skinned enough and have enough white-looking European features to pass as a white person.
And so they would live their lives as a white person.
And now, we hear about these stories, which I personally find very funny, of people that are living now, are white, and all of a sudden they go get a DNA test and start looking into history and realize, my grandfather or my grandmother was actually black, and we just didn't know.
Carol Channing was passing.
Yeah.
The comedian Carol Channing.
Oh, I never knew that one.
She was passing. Cary Grant was passing.
See the things you learn.
So listen, they have a whole book on who was passing.
That's another podcast idea.
Phyllis Diller.
Thank you. Thank you for that podcast idea. Okay, so now that we've talked about this, I think this is a good point where we can talk about, so in addition to talking about it, how do we as individuals change this within our own families, within our own race, within our own people of color who look like us? How do we start?
I think it happens in the everyday conversations. It happens when we're talking about makeup. It happens when someone makes a comment about me being light-skinned, which happens often, that you kind of say, hey.
And how does that make you feel? As like a psychiatrist, how do you feel when...
How does that make you feel? I think I'm kind of used to it, but again, as with the same thing with, the discussions in my family, I've gotten used to just being able to say, hey, one, that's not correct. It doesn't make me any better. It doesn't, and there's always the assumption that, there's also the assumption, for me being light-skinned, I always get the, I'm stuck up. Apparently, this comes automatically when you're lighter-skinned. And so, there are all of these other attributes that get put on you when you are darker or lighter. And even in jokes, and I know, we like to joke and chill with our friends, and these things come up, and if you think that it's not, if I'm talking to Kika and she makes a joke, I know she's probably just making a joke to mess with me. But if you're in a space where you're not sure if that person really gets it or is, quote unquote, woke enough to understand it, then it's having the conversation. And it might not be having the conversation in the middle of dinner. It might be later on saying, hey, listen, this wasn't appropriate, And for me, again, it's always centering, the black people in the room. And then once I center the black people in the room, it's, if we're on a panel, in a conference, it's making sure that I am centering the darkest person of that group of black people, because it's important.
Kika, how did we solve this?
Well, conversations like these, like podcasts, and us being in a digital writing space, having open and honest conversations. So a lot of times in digital spaces and, social justice circles, people want pretty words, and sometimes you just can't say it in a pretty way. This is just what it is. So being direct and honest about the ramifications of colorism in our communities. It's time that we be honest about it. It's time that we talk about the damage that our grandparents have done to their kids. It's time to be honest about that. It's time to be honest about if you're a mom or a dad and you favor one kid over the other. It happens.
Because of color.
Because of color. It happens now. Let's be honest about that. Let's unpack that. Because what's happening are general conversations well, my teacher didn't treat me well. But no, let's talk about what goes on in our families directly. We need to have open, honest conversations.
And it's difficult to start that. Because, again, we talked about it's difficult to talk about that.
But, black people,
relatives.
you don't tell you don't say nothing. You hold
Not
it
to
in.
grandma, no.
Yeah, you hold it in. But look what holding it in has done to us.
Elif, how do we fix this?
I agree within our familial spheres, but I also think inviting people who have never experienced colorism and who don't know what it is. I have white friends that laugh at the idea of white privilege because they don't know what that is. And here are the rest of us who know everything about white privilege because it completely alters the way we live. You have to be cautious. You're politicized. You're a walking target. So I think that we also need to invite people outside these circles and just raise awareness of what this is and the impacts on our kids, and hope that they don't have to go through things like these in the future.
I don't believe that white people don't know white privilege exists. I believe they know. I believe that they choose to ignore it. Like, if you know when you have it better than a group of people, a certain group of people, whether you're a poor white person or a rich white person. I don't believe that people are like, oh my God, that exists in your community. Girl, I don't buy that. I believe that people know about their privilege. Whether or not you choose to fight to make things better for other people using that privilege is one thing. People have to be invited to do that, but just not knowing, nah, I don't buy that.
And that just brings up another podcast. So
Write this down.
I'm writing this all down. So I hope that we have today begun this conversation, but to educate people about this whole idea, people of color and also non-people of color, if that's such a term. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll have the question of the day. Celia is familiar with this. All of the guests, I ask them to fill in the blank. And the question is, or the statement is, when it comes to race, I admit, and you fill in the blank. So we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back. We truly thank you for listening to Colorblind Race Across Generations. This is not the end of the podcast, though, because when we come back, we'll hear the answer to the question or the statement. When it comes to race, I admit. You're listening. We want your friends to listen too. Isn't that right, Keith?
That's right. You figured it out. Help everybody else figure it out.
And you can find us wherever you like to listen to your podcasts.
Yeah.
Welcome back. So the question of the day for our guest as we close things out on our great conversation that we've had about colorism. Celie, you've been here before, so we'll start with you. When it comes to race, I admit.
When it comes to race, I admit that I haven't always wanted to step into my blackness because of the perception of the outside world.
Which means?
But now I'm in my 40s, so it doesn't really matter. It's meant that for the comfort of others, we're talking about, making people uncomfortable. For the comfort of others, sometimes I've taken a step back and not, stepped fully into it. Again, having to do with all those things that we talked about before, being in diaspora, the issues that are dealt with in the Caribbean, things like that, and here. Because there's a perception here, when I came to the South, I was told that I wasn't black. And so, again, another podcast. But I have learned with age and with learning and, people around me and support and just knowing that I'm raising a black child who's going to be a black woman has been making sure that that there's never a question as to who she is and that there's never a question as to who I am, regardless of what I hear being, sounding off. Because again, there have been plenty of times that I have stepped in and I have said this, and I say it really quietly because I don't want to disturb the force, and I don't have that filter anymore. And it's taken time for me to step into that and say it out loud and shout it out and not be worried about someone wanting to question my percentages and, all of that comes with, the thought of blackness and what blackness actually means in this country and across the world.
Kika, when it comes to race, I admit.
I am racially biased. And I would have said prejudiced a year ago, but I can't say I'm prejudiced because I have white friends that I actually care about and respect, but damn sure racially biased towards black.
Which means?
Which means I center black people before everybody. No matter what I do in my business, when I choose a business, when I make friends, when I choose to hang out with people, I center black people.
Elif, when it comes to race, I admit.
I admit that my hijab throws everyone off, so they don't know what to do with me. When it comes to race, I admit that it's so vast, there are ignorances that I need to tap into. There's a lot more to learn and to improve upon. Yeah, that's it.
Excellent. Thank you, ladies, for joining us today. Phew. Okay, we unpacked a lot of interesting information and tidbits on that. I think colorism is one of those terms that a lot of people might not be familiar with, Keith.
Nope, did not know about that one today.
But I think it's something that maybe people have experienced or knew about, just didn't know that there was actually a term for it. That's one of the purposes we have for this podcast. We want to get people to talk about issues that relate to race, but to do it with an open heart and an open mind, and hopefully not be afraid to ask questions.
That is what this whole room here is.
That is, and to be candid. Even though people can't see the room, we are in a room, and it's quite swanky and fancy.
It's very candid.
It's not really fancy and swanky.
Very candid, right next to the donuts, boxes of
All those
coffee.
things.
Very candid.
In our official office here. So we thank you for joining us for this episode of Colorblind Race Across Generations, and we'll be back with another episode soon. See ya.